The creepiest sleep habits of ancient Celtic tribes in the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Britain and Ireland, where standing stones pierce the morning fog and ancient burial mounds dot the landscape like sleeping giants, the Celtic peoples developed some of the most intricate and fascinating sleep customs the world has ever known. These were not merely practical arrangements for rest, but elaborate rituals that wove together the world of the living and the dead, the realm of spirits and mortals, in ways that would seem deeply unsettling to our modern sensibilities. Tonight, you will journey through 4 remarkable stories that reveal the hidden sleep practices of the ancient Celts, customs so deeply embedded in their spiritual worldview that they shaped every aspect of how these remarkable people approached the vulnerable hours of darkness. From sacred temples where pilgrims slept to receive divine visions, to elaborate vigils held over the dead, from household protections against night-flying spirits, to seasonal rituals that mark the turning of the year through sleep and dreams, these stories will immerse you in a world where the boundary between waking and sleeping was far more permeable than anything we experience today. You find yourself walking through the dense woodlands of what is now the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, England, but in the time we speak of, sometime in the 4th century CE, this was the sacred territory of Nodens, the Celtic healing god whose very name whispered promises of divine intervention through the medium of sleep. The Romano-British temple dedicated to this mysterious deity at Lydney Park was unlike any other religious structure of its time, for it was designed not for daytime worship, but for the sacred act of sleeping in the presence of the divine. Bidor temple complex rose from a hill that the local people called Dwarf's Hill, though whether this name referred to ancient spirits dwelling within the earth or to the mysterious underground chambers that honeycombed the site remains a matter for scholarly debate. What we do know from the careful excavations conducted by Tessa and Mortimer Wheeler in 1928-29, with the assistance of a young J.R.R. Tolkien, who would later draw inspiration from this very site for his Lord of the Rings, is that this was a place where the ordinary rules of sleep and waking were deliberately suspended. The temple itself was a substantial rectangular building, measuring approximately 80 by 60 feet, with thick stone walls that enclosed a central courtyard open to the sky. But it was not the architecture alone that made this place extraordinary. It was the purpose for which it was constructed. This was a temple of dream incubation, a practice that had deep roots in Celtic spirituality long before the Romans arrived in Britain. Here, pilgrims would come not to pray standing upright in daylight, but to lie down in the sacred precincts and surrender themselves to sleep, believing that in their dreams they would receive direct communication from Nodens himself. The god Nodens was a complex deity whose influence extended far beyond simple healing. In Celtic mythology, he was associated with the hunt, with dogs, his sacred animals, and with the mysterious realm that existed between life and death, between consciousness and dreams. His name appears in various forms throughout Celtic lands, Nuada in Ireland, Lud in Wales, suggesting a pan-Celtic recognition of this powerful deity whose domain included the vulnerable state of sleep. Unlike the solar deities who ruled the daylight hours, Nodens was a god of liminal spaces, of thresholds and transitions, of the shadowy hours when the veil between worlds grew thin. The pilgrims who made their way to Lydney Park came from across Roman Britain, drawn by tales of miraculous healings and prophetic visions granted to those who dared to sleep within the god's sacred precincts. They were not merely the desperately ill seeking physical cure, though many such suppliants certainly made the journey. Archaeological evidence suggests that the temple attracted a diverse array of visitors, soldiers seeking guidance before battle, merchants hoping for prosperity, women desiring fertility, and scholars pursuing knowledge that could only be obtained through divine revelation. The process of dream incubation at Nodens' temple was not a casual affair. Pilgrims were required to undergo extensive preparation before they could enter the sacred sleeping chambers. This preparation began with ritual purification at the iron-rich Shalibite spring that bubbled up from the earth near the temple complex. The waters of this spring were believed to possess healing properties in their own right, their reddish tinge, caused by high iron content, regarded as a sign of the god's life-giving blood flowing through the earth itself. After bathing in these sacred waters, pilgrims would don clean white garments and enter the temple complex through a carefully prescribed ritual sequence. They would first present offerings at the main altar: coins, jewelry, small bronze figurines, and most commonly, votive representations of dogs, Nodens, sacred animals. The temple floors were found to be littered with hundreds of these offerings, each one representing a desperate plea for the god's intervention in the dream realm. The actual sleeping arrangements within the temple were far more elaborate than simple beds or mattresses. Archaeological excavations revealed evidence of raised stone platforms covered with thick woolen mattresses and furs, arranged in carefully planned positions that aligned with celestial phenomena. Some of these sleeping platforms were oriented toward the rising sun, others toward particular stars or constellations that held significance in Celtic astronomy. The positioning was not random. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of how celestial influences might affect the content and quality of divine dreams. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the temple was its underground chambers, a complex network of stone-lined rooms and passages that extended deep beneath the main temple structure. These subterranean spaces were not mere storage areas or crypts. They were integral to the dream incubation process. Some pilgrims, particularly those seeking the most profound revelations, would spend their sacred sleep period in these underground chambers, surrounded by complete darkness and the constant sound of underground springs flowing through hidden channels in the rock. The temple maintained a permanent staff of priest-physicians who oversaw the dream incubation process. These religious specialists, trained in both Celtic healing traditions and Greco-Roman medical knowledge, carefully monitored the sleeping pilgrims throughout the night. They recorded dreams, interpreted their symbolic content, and prescribed specific treatments based on the divine messages received during sleep. Their detailed records, some of which survived on lead curse tablets found during excavations, provide fascinating glimpses into the complex relationship between sleep, dreams, and healing in Celtic religious practice. One particularly intriguing curse tablet found at the site tells the story of a stolen ring and the dreamer's plea to Nodens for justice. The tablet reads, "To the god Nodens, Silvianus has lost his ring and given half its value to Nodens. Among those named Senicianus do not allow health until he brings it to the temple of Nodin." This curse tablet, with its reference to a stolen ring and the demand for its return to the temple, reportedly inspired Tolkien's conception of the One Ring in his later literary works. The cult of Nodens and the practice of dream incubation at Lydney Park represented a fascinating synthesis of Celtic and Roman religious traditions. The Celts had long believed in the prophetic power of dreams and the ability of certain sacred sites to facilitate divine communication through sleep. The Romans, with their more systematic approach to religion and architecture, provided the organizational structure and building techniques that allowed these ancient practices to flourish on an unprecedented scale. As evening approached and the time for sacred sleep drew near, you can imagine the atmosphere within the temple complex. Oil lamps flickered in wall niches, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls decorated with images of Nodens in his various forms, sometimes as a bearded king with a crown, sometimes as a hunter accompanied by his sacred hounds, sometimes as a figure standing at the threshold between two worlds, one foot in the realm of the living and one in the domain of the dead. The pilgrims would lie upon their assigned sleeping platforms, their heads resting on stone pillows carved with protective symbols, their bodies covered with woolen blankets that had been blessed by the temple priests. In the growing darkness, the sound of the underground springs became more pronounced, a constant whisper that seemed to call the conscious mind toward the threshold of sleep. The air grew thick with the scent of burning incense, juniper berries, sacred to Nodens and other aromatic herbs that were believed to facilitate prophetic dreams. But as these ancient pilgrims prepared to surrender themselves to the god's care through the medium of sleep, questions lingered in the air as thick as the incense smoke. What dreams would come to them in this sacred space? Would Nodens appear to them directly, or would his messages arrive wrapped in symbols that required careful interpretation? And most unsettling of all, what price might the god demand in exchange for the divine knowledge granted through dreams? In the depths of a winter night in the year 367 CE, a young Roman officer named Marcus Flavius lay upon one of the sacred sleeping platforms in Nodens' temple, his body racked with fever from a wound that refused to heal. He had travelled from Pichtim, the northern frontier, where Pictish raids had left him with a spear thrust to his thigh that had festered despite the ministrations of military physicians. Now, as his final hope, he had come to this strange Celtic holy place to seek healing. Through the medium of dreams, Marcus was not alone in his desperate pilgrimage. The temple records, preserved on wax tablets found in the underground chambers, reveal the extraordinary diversity of those who sought Nodens' intervention through sacred sleep. There was Claudia Severa, the wife of a British chieftain, who came seeking visions that would reveal the fate of her husband captured in a tribal war. Beside her slept Gaius Valerius, a merchant from Londinium who had lost 3 trading ships to storms and needed the god's guidance to restore his fortune. In the darker corners of the temple lay those whose ailments were of the mind rather than the body. Veterans haunted by battlefield memories, women driven to distraction by visions of dead children, priests who had lost their faith and sought restoration through divine dreams. The process of achieving sacred sleep at Nodens' temple was far more complex than simply lying down and waiting for visions to come. The Celtic priests had developed elaborate techniques for inducing the specific type of consciousness required for divine communication. These methods, passed down through generations of druids and adapted for the Romano-British context, involved careful manipulation of the pilgrim's physical and mental state in the hours leading up to sleep. The preparation began at sunset with the consumption of a special potion prepared by the temple priests. This sacred drink contained a complex mixture of herbs known for their psychoactive properties: mugwort for enhancing dream clarity, vervain for protection against evil spirits, and small amounts of henbane for its mildly hallucinogenic effects. The exact composition of these potions was a closely guarded secret, known only to the highest-ranking temple priests and passed down through carefully maintained oral traditions. After consuming the sacred potion, pilgrims underwent a series of purification rituals designed to cleanse both body and spirit before entering the dream realm. They bathed again in the iron-rich spring water, this time by moonlight, while priests chanted invocations to Nodens in the ancient Celtic tongue. The words of these chants, preserved in fragmentary form on stone inscriptions found throughout the temple complex, revealed the deep connection between sleep, death, and divine revelation in Celtic religious thought. One particularly haunting chant, reconstructed from multiple inscribed fragments, reads, "Nodens of the deep waters, Nodens of the sacred hounds, open the gates of sleep that lead to your dwelling place. As the sun dies in the west and darkness claims the land, let your servants pass through the threshold of dreams to stand before your throne. Grant us visions of what was, what is, and what shall be, that we may return to the waking world with your wisdom burning in our heart." The sleeping arrangements themselves were carefully calibrated to induce the altered states of consciousness necessary for divine communication. Each sleeping platform was positioned at a specific angle designed to align the sleeper's head with magnetic north based on Celtic beliefs about the flow of spiritual energy through the earth. The stone pillows were carved with intricate spiral patterns that were meant to channel this energy directly into the dreamer's mind, creating conditions favorable for prophetic visions. Temperature control was another crucial element of the dream incubation process. The underground chambers maintained a constant cool temperature year-round, while the above-ground sleeping areas could be heated with braziers or allowed to remain cold, depending on the specific type of vision being sought. Hot conditions were believed to promote dreams of fire, war, and passion, while cold environments encouraged visions of water, healing, and the other world. The priests carefully adjusted these conditions based on each pilgrim's particular needs and the nature of their petition to the god. The actual experience of sacred sleep in Nodens' temple was far from peaceful. Pilgrims reported vivid, often terrifying dreams that seemed to transport them to otherworldly realms where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. These were not gentle healing dreams, but powerful, sometimes violent visions that left the dreamers fundamentally changed. Marcus Flavius, the wounded Roman officer, later described his experience in a letter to his sister that survived among the temple archives. "I found myself standing in a vast hall filled with mist and shadows, where enormous hounds with eyes, like burning coals, paced back and forth before a throne carved from a single massive stone. Upon this throne sat a figure whose face I could not clearly see, though I knew without doubt that this was the god himself. He spoke to me, not with words, but with images that appeared directly in my mind. I saw my wound as it truly was, not merely damaged flesh, but a spiritual corruption that had taken root in my soul. I watched as spectral hands, whether those of the god or his servants I could not tell, reached into my body and drew out long, writhing shadows that I understood to be the source of my affliction. Such visions were common among those who underwent dream incubation at the temple. The dreams often involved journeys to otherworldly realms, encounters with supernatural beings, and symbolic scenarios that required careful interpretation by the temple priests. Many pilgrims reported meeting deceased relatives in their dreams, who served as intermediaries between the living and the divine realm of Nodens. Others described visions of future events, though these prophecies were typically shrouded in symbolic language that made their meaning ambiguous until after the predicted events had come to pass. The temple priests maintained detailed records of these dream experiences, categorizing them according to type and apparent significance. They recognized several distinct categories of sacred dreams: healing dreams that provided specific medical guidance, prophetic dreams that revealed future events, guidance dreams that offered solutions to practical problems, and warning dreams that alerted the dreamer to spiritual or physical dangers. Each category required different interpretive techniques and often led to different prescribed actions upon awakening. But not all who sought divine dreams at Nodens' temple received the visions they hoped for. The god was known to be selective in his revelations, and some pilgrims experienced only ordinary sleep or, worse yet, nightmares that seemed to mock their desperate faith. The temple priests explained such failures as evidence of spiritual impurity or insufficient devotion, but privately they recognized that the dream incubation process was inherently unpredictable. Even with careful preparation and ideal conditions, divine communication through dreams remained at the mercy of forces beyond human control. The most powerful and sought-after dreams were those that occurred in the underground chambers, where the complete absence of natural light created conditions unlike anywhere else in the ancient world. Pilgrims who slept in these subterranean spaces reported dreams of extraordinary vividness and apparent prophetic accuracy. They described visiting underground cities populated by the spirits of the ancient dead, receiving instruction from long-deceased druids, and witnessing cosmic events that would not unfold in the waking world for months or years to come. One surviving account from the temple archives describes the dream experience of a British chieftain's daughter who came to the temple seeking visions of her people's fate under Roman rule. She slept for 3 consecutive nights in the deepest underground chamber, surrounded by the constant sound of flowing water and the faint phosphorescent glow of mineral deposits in the cave walls. On the 3rd night, she reported a dream so vivid and detailed that the temple priests transcribed her account in its entirety. In her vision, she found herself standing on a high hill overlooking a vast plain where 2 great armies faced each other across a river. One army bore the eagles of Rome, their shields glinting in sunlight like scales on a great serpent. The other army carried the standards of the British tribes, their war cries echoing across the water like the voices of ancient gods. But as she watched, a mist began to rise from the river, and when it cleared, both armies had vanished, leaving only empty fields where wildflowers grew among scattered weapons and broken shields. The interpretation of this dream proved prophetic. Within a decade, the Roman legions would begin their gradual withdrawal from Britain, leaving the native peoples to face new challenges from Saxon invaders. But the true significance of the vision lay not in its apparent historical accuracy, but in its demonstration of the profound psychological and spiritual transformation that could occur through the practice of sacred sleep in Nodon's temple, as dawn approached and the time for awakening drew near. The pilgrims who had spent the night in divine dreams found themselves changed in ways that went beyond mere healing or the receipt of practical guidance. They had touched something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself, experienced firsthand the permeable boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. They had slept not merely as human beings seeking rest, but as vessels for divine communication, conduits through which the God could speak to the waking world. But as these transformed pilgrims prepared to leave the sacred precincts and return to their ordinary lives, troubling questions remained unanswered. What was the true cost of receiving divine knowledge through dreams? Did the God demand something in return for his revelations, some payment that might only become apparent years or decades later? And most unsettling of all, once a person had experienced the profound intimacy of divine communication through sacred sleep, how could they ever again find satisfaction in ordinary human consciousness? The autumn mists hung heavy over Lydney Park as Gaius Sertorius, the temple's chief priest, made his final rounds through the sacred sleeping chambers. It was the night before Samhain, Halloween in the Celtic calendar, when the veil between worlds grew thinnest and the practice of dream incubation reached its most potent and dangerous peak. For 30 years, Sertorius had overseen the sacred sleep rituals at Nodon's temple, and in that time he had witnessed transformations, both miraculous and terrible, healings that defied explanation, and revelations that had changed the course of history. But tonight felt different. Tonight, as he gazed upon the 17 pilgrims who lay upon the sacred sleeping platforms, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight, Sertorius found himself troubled by questions that had been growing in his mind for months. The god's price for his divine interventions seemed to be increasing, and the nature of that price was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The first indication that something had changed in the temple's sacred sleep practices had come 3 months earlier, when a young Celtic nobleman named Bran ap Caradog had emerged from a night in the underground chambers, claiming to have received a prophecy of extraordinary significance. In his dream, he had witnessed the final battle between the old gods and the new Christian faith that was slowly spreading across Britain. The vision had been so vivid, so detailed, that Sertorius had carefully recorded every word of the young man's account in the temple's secret archives. But within days of his prophetic dream, Bran had begun to change in disturbing ways. He claimed that he could no longer sleep without experiencing visions, that the boundary between dream and waking had become permanently dissolved in his consciousness. He spoke of seeing spirits everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, in the spaces between heartbeats. Most troubling of all, he insisted that Nodens continued to communicate with him even when he was fully awake, commanding him to perform acts that grew increasingly strange and dangerous. The transformation culminated when Bran attempted to sacrifice himself at the temple's main altar, claiming that the god had demanded his life as payment for the prophecy he had received. Only the quick intervention of the temple guards had prevented the sacrifice, but the incident had left Sertorius deeply shaken. In all his years of service to Nodens, he had never witnessed such complete spiritual possession, resulting from dream incubation. Bran's case was not isolated. Over the following weeks, other pilgrims who had received particularly powerful divine dreams began reporting similar experiences. They spoke of being unable to distinguish between sleeping and waking states, of receiving constant communications from entities they believed to be divine messengers, of feeling compelled to perform increasingly bizarre rituals in their daily lives. Some abandoned their families and livelihoods to become wandering prophets, claiming to speak for Nodens wherever they traveled. Others withdrew from human society entirely, spending their days in meditation and their nights in attempts to recreate the profound dream experiences they had enjoyed at the temple. The pattern was becoming clear to Sertorius, though he was reluctant to acknowledge its implications. The most powerful forms of divine communication through sacred sleep seemed to exact a terrible price: the gradual dissolution of the recipient's normal human consciousness. Those who experienced the deepest communion with Nodens in their dreams found themselves permanently altered, unable to fully return to ordinary waking life. The problem was particularly acute among those who slept in the underground chambers, where the combination of sensory deprivation, psychoactive herbs, and proximity to the sacred springs created conditions that pushed human consciousness to its absolute limits. These deep chambers, originally designed to facilitate the most profound divine revelations, were beginning to seem more like gateways to a realm from which some travelers might never fully return. As Sertorius moved through the temple complex, on this Samhain night, checking on each sleeping pilgrim, he reflected on the evolution of dream incubation practices over the centuries. The earliest Celtic druids had understood that communion with the divine realm through sleep was inherently dangerous, requiring careful safeguards and gradual preparation. They had developed elaborate training programs that could take years to complete, slowly accustoming initiates to the altered states of consciousness required for prophetic dreaming. But the Roman influence on the temple had introduced a more systematic, efficient approach that prioritized immediate results over long-term spiritual safety. Roman pilgrims, accustomed to quick solutions and practical outcomes, had little patience for the gradual preparation methods favored by traditional Celtic priests. They wanted healing, guidance, or prophecy, and they wanted it within a single night's stay at the temple. The priests had gradually modified their techniques to accommodate these expectations, creating more intense experiences that could produce dramatic results in shorter time frames. The consequence of this acceleration was becoming increasingly apparent. The traditional Celtic methods had included built-in safeguards, ritual purifications, protective charms, careful monitoring by experienced priests that helped dreamers maintain their connection to ordinary reality even while experiencing divine visions. The streamlined Roman approach had eliminated many of these safeguards in favor of efficiency, leaving pilgrims more vulnerable to the transformative power of direct divine communication. The temple's archives contained numerous accounts of pilgrims who had experienced profound spiritual transformations through dream incubation, but recent entries revealed an alarming trend toward psychological instability and social dysfunction among those who received the most powerful divine revelations. Many never returned to their previous lives, becoming permanent wanderers who claimed to exist in a state of constant communion with the divine realm. Others experienced what the priests described as dream madness, a condition in which the recipient became unable to distinguish between symbolic dream imagery and literal reality. One particularly disturbing case involved a Roman matron named Livia Drusilla, who had come to the temple seeking guidance about her son's military career. After spending 3 nights in the underground chambers, she emerged claiming to have received detailed instructions from Nodens about a series of ritual murders that needed to be performed to ensure her son's safety. The instructions were so specific and so seemingly authentic that it took considerable effort by the temple priests to convince her that she had misinterpreted symbolic dream imagery as literal divine commands. The increasing frequency of such incidents had led Sertorius to question whether the practice of dream incubation at Nodens' temple was fundamentally changing in response to some larger cosmic shift. The approaching dominance of Christianity across the Roman Empire seemed to be affecting the nature of pagan religious experiences, intensifying them in ways that made them more dangerous and less predictable. It was as if the old gods, sensing their time was drawing to a close, were demanding a higher price for their interventions in human affairs. The physical effects of intense dream incubation were also becoming more pronounced. Pilgrims who experienced the most powerful divine dreams often emerged from their sacred sleep with permanent physical changes, premature graying of hair, unusual scarring patterns that appeared to have no natural cause, and most disturbing of all, changes in eye color that seemed to reflect permanent alteration of their spiritual essence. These physical transformations were accompanied by enhanced psychic abilities, spontaneous prophetic visions, the ability to communicate with spirits, and an uncanny intuition about future events, but they came at the cost of the recipient's ability to live a normal human life. The economic impact of these transformations was also significant. Families frequently complained that their relatives had returned from the temple as fundamentally different people, no longer capable of fulfilling their previous social and economic roles. Merchants abandoned their businesses to become wandering. Prophets, soldiers deserted their posts to pursue mystical visions, and mothers left their children to follow divine callings that others could neither see nor understand. As midnight approached on this Samhain night, Sertorius found himself standing in the temple's central courtyard, looking up at the stars that wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed to mirror the complexity of the divine realm accessible through sacred sleep. He understood now that the practice of dream incubation at Nodens' temple had evolved into something far more powerful and dangerous than its original Celtic practitioners had ever intended. The combination of Roman efficiency with Celtic mysticism had created a spiritual technology capable of producing genuine divine communication, but at a cost that was becoming too high to ignore. The pilgrims sleeping in the chambers around him would likely experience profound visions before dawn, and some of those visions would contain genuine prophetic knowledge or authentic healing power. But Sartorius knew that at least some of them would also emerge fundamentally changed, no longer fully human, in ways that would affect not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone they encountered. The god's price for his divine gifts was becoming clearer with each passing season. Those who sought the deepest communion with the divine realm through sacred sleep risked losing their connection to ordinary human consciousness forever. As the night deepened and the first sounds of supernatural activity began to echo from the underground chambers, the whispered voices that no waking person should be able to hear, the footsteps of beings that cast no shadows, Sartorius faced a terrible realization. The practice that had once offered hope and healing to desperate pilgrims was transforming into something that might ultimately consume those it claimed to serve. The question that would haunt him through the remaining hours of this Samhain night was not whether divine communication through sleep was possible, but whether human consciousness was truly equipped to survive such direct contact with the realm of the gods. The rain drummed steadily against the thatched roof of the stone cottage as young Seamus McBride lit the first of many candles that would burn through the long night ahead. Inside the cottage's main room, his grandfather Cormac lay upon the wooden bed where he had drawn his final breath 3 hours earlier, his weathered hands folded across his chest and his eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. But this was no ordinary slumber, and the night ahead would be unlike any other that the McBride family had ever experienced. According to the ancient Celtic tradition known as the Lyke-Wake, a word that meant literally corpse watch, Cormac's body would not be left alone until the moment of burial. Someone from the family must remain awake and vigilant beside the deceased throughout every hour of darkness, for the Celts believed that the newly dead were vulnerable to spiritual predators that prowled the night seeking to claim unguarded souls. Seamus had volunteered for the first watch, though at 17 years old he had never participated in a full Lyke-Wake before. His grandmother Bridget had spent the afternoon preparing him for the ordeal ahead, explaining the intricate rules and customs that govern the wake tradition with the solemnity of someone passing down sacred knowledge. The instructions were precise and non-negotiable. The watcher must never fall asleep, must never leave the room where the body lay, and must never allow the candles to burn out completely, for darkness was the enemy's ally. As evening deepened into night, other family members and neighbors began to arrive at the cottage, their faces grave with the responsibility of the ritual ahead. The wake was not merely a time for mourning. It was a complex ceremonial process designed to guide the deceased safely through the dangerous transition from life to death, while protecting the living from the supernatural forces that such transitions inevitably attracted. The first order of business was the preparation of the corpse itself, a process that involved far more than simple washing and dressing. According to tradition, Cormac's body had been carefully positioned on the bed with his head pointing toward the west, the direction of the setting sun and the entrance to the Celtic otherworld. A plate of salt and a plate of soil had been placed. Upon his chest, the salt representing the immortal soul and the soil symbolizing the earthly body that would soon return to the earth. But the arrangement of these plates was more than symbolic. In some Celtic communities, designated individuals known as sin-eaters would perform an elaborate ritual over the deceased, reciting ancient incantations over the plates before consuming their contents, thus taking upon themselves any sins that might prevent the dead person's soul from achieving peaceful rest in the afterlife. The practice was controversial even among the Celts themselves, as it required the sin eater to willingly burden their own soul with another's spiritual corruption. The physical layout of the cottage had been completely transformed for the wake. All furniture and mirrors were draped with white linens, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that separated this sacred space from the ordinary world of the living. The white coverings served multiple purposes. They prevented spirits from becoming confused about their own nature by seeing their reflections, and they created a uniform visual environment that helped focus the mourner's attention on the spiritual, rather than the material aspects of existence. Around the hearth, the women of the community had gathered to begin the ancient practice of keening, a ritualized form of mourning that combined elements of singing, wailing, and storytelling in patterns that had been passed down through countless generations. The keening women, known in Gaelic as Bean Tuiriam, were skilled practitioners who understood the precise emotional and spiritual requirements of wake music. Their voices rose and fell in harmonies that seemed to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, creating a soundscape that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The men of the community had different responsibilities during the wake. While the women maintained the emotional and spiritual atmosphere through keening and storytelling, the men were charged with the practical aspects of protection and sustenance. They maintained the fire in the hearth, ensured that fresh candles were always available to replace those that burned down, and most importantly, they served as guards against any supernatural entities that might attempt to interfere with the wake process. As the night progressed, the atmosphere in the cottage began to take on qualities that defied ordinary explanation. The constant sound of keening, combined with the flickering candlelight and the ever-present awareness of death, created a psychological environment unlike anything experienced in normal daily life. Participants in Celtic wakes frequently reported seeing shadows that moved independently of their sources, hearing voices that seemed to come from empty corners of the room, and sensing presences that could not be attributed to any of the living mourners present. These phenomena were not dismissed as imagination or grief-induced hallucinations. Celtic tradition held that the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead became particularly permeable during wakes, allowing entities from both sides to cross over temporarily. The deceased person's spirit was believed to remain present in the room for several days after death, gradually adjusting to their new state of existence and preparing for the journey to the other world. During this transition period, they might communicate with the living through signs, sounds, or direct spiritual contact, but the dead person's spirit was not the only supernatural presence that wakes were expected to attract. The Celts believed that death created a kind of spiritual disturbance that drew the attention of various otherworldly entities, not all of them benevolent. Malevolent spirits known as slua, the restless dead who had been denied peaceful rest, were particularly attracted to wakes, hoping to either possess the newly deceased soul or to use the spiritual energy of the gathering to strengthen their own ability to interfere in the world of the living. The protective measures employed during Celtic wakes were elaborate and precisely prescribed. Iron objects, horseshoes, knives, nails, were placed around the room and on the body itself, as iron was believed to repel hostile spirits. Salt was sprinkled in a circle around the bed and at all entrances to the room, creating a barrier that malevolent entities could not cross. Most importantly, the watchers themselves served as a living protective barrier, their constant vigilance and spiritual awareness maintaining a defensive perimeter around the vulnerable deceased. The provision of food and drink during wakes served purposes beyond simple hospitality. The watchers received specific nourishment at prescribed times, whiskey at the beginning of the night, and tea or beer with bread during the middle hours. This sustenance was not merely to keep the mourners comfortable during the long vigil. It was believed to strengthen their spiritual resistance to supernatural influence. The whiskey, in particular, was thought to enhance the watcher's ability to perceive and resist spiritual threats, while the bread and beverage consumed at midnight provided earthly grounding that helped maintain their connection to the living world. The stories told during wakes were carefully chosen to serve the spiritual needs of both the living and the dead. These were not casual entertainments, but rather carefully preserved narratives that dealt with themes of death, transformation, and the journey between worlds. Many of these stories featured characters who had successfully navigated the challenges of death and achieved peaceful rest in the other world, providing both comfort to the mourners and guidance to the deceased spirit. Scripture reading was also an integral part of the wake tradition, though the specific passages were selected not merely for their religious content, but for their protective properties. Psalm 91, John 15, and 1 Corinthians 15 were particularly favored, as these texts were believed to create a spiritual shield around the wake participants while providing comfort and guidance to the deceased soul. The words were not simply read, but chanted in particular rhythms that harmonized with the keening of the women, creating a complex auditory environment that was both beautiful and spiritually powerful. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the cottage grew increasingly charged with supernatural energy. The shadows cast by the candles seemed to move with purposes of their own, and the constant sound of rain on the roof began to take on rhythmic patterns that seemed almost like otherworldly communication. The watchers found themselves in a state of heightened awareness, simultaneously exhausted by the emotional weight of their vigil and energized by the spiritual intensity of the experience. But even as the first night of the wake progressed toward dawn, troubling questions began to emerge from the depths of the ancient tradition. What exactly were the supernatural forces that the Celtic wake customs were designed to repel? How had countless generations of mourners learned to distinguish between benevolent visits from the deceased and malevolent intrusions from hostile spirits? And most unsettling of all, what happened to communities that failed to maintain proper vigilance during the vulnerable hours when death hung like a veil over the gathering? The second night of Cormac MacBride's wake brought with it phenomena that tested the resolve of even the most experienced mourners. As darkness settled over the Scottish Highlands, the cottage filled with relatives and neighbours who had travelled from distant villages to participate in the sacred vigil. Among them was old Moira Sinclair, a woman whose reputation as a bean-feaser, a wise woman skilled in the ancient ways, made her presence both comforting and ominous. Moira had overseen more than 50 wakes during her lifetime, and she understood the intricate spiritual dynamics that governed the interaction between the living and the dead during these crucial nights. She took her position near the head of Cormac's bed with the gravity of someone who had witnessed firsthand the consequences of improper wake procedures. Her weathered hands moved constantly over a collection of protective charms, pieces of iron, blessed salt, and sprigs of rowan tree, while her eyes scanned the room with the vigilance of a sentry watching for enemy approach. The second night of a wake was traditionally considered the most dangerous, for it was during this period that the deceased's spirit was believed to be making its final decision about whether to depart peacefully for the other world or to linger in the realm of the living. Celtic tradition held that spirits who chose to remain among the living often did so out of unfinished business, unresolved guilt, or excessive attachment to earthly concerns. Such spirits could become problematic for the living, appearing in dreams, moving objects, or even attempting to possess family members who shared strong emotional bonds with the deceased. The arrangement of Cormac's body on the second night reflected these concerns. His position had been carefully adjusted to ensure maximum comfort for the spiritual journey ahead. He lay upon a couch-like bed, decorated with furs and cushions, with a pillow of plaited grass beneath his head. This positioning was not merely about dignity or comfort, it was designed to create the impression that death was simply another form of sleep, a peaceful rest from which the deceased might eventually awaken in a better place. The Celtic understanding of death as a form of sleep permeated every aspect of wake customs. Unlike later Christian traditions that emphasized the finality of death, Celtic beliefs suggested that the boundary between sleeping and dying was fluid and permeable. The dead were thought to experience something analogous to sleep, a state of altered consciousness in which they could still perceive and interact with the living world, though in limited ways. This belief had profound implications for wake procedures. The mourners were required to behave as if the deceased might still be capable of hearing, seeing, and feeling everything that occurred in their presence. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, not out of reverence alone, but from genuine concern that loud voices might disturb the deceased's spiritual rest. Actions were performed with deliberate care, as if Cormac might at any moment open his eyes and comment on the proceedings. The food offerings placed around the deathbed served multiple purposes in this context. Plates of bread, bowls of milk, and cups of ale were arranged within easy reach of the deceased's hands, providing spiritual nourishment for the journey to the other world, while demonstrating the family's continued care for their departed relative. These offerings were not merely symbolic, they were believed to possess actual nutritional value for spirits, who could absorb the essence of food and drink, even if they could no longer physically consume them. But the most crucial aspect of the second night's vigil was the maintenance of proper spiritual vigilance among the watchers themselves. The combination of exhaustion, grief, and the hypnotic effects of constant keening created psychological conditions that made the mourners particularly susceptible to supernatural influence. Several times during the night, Moira had to sharply warn younger participants who showed signs of falling into trances or experiencing visions that might indicate spiritual possession. The phenomenon of spiritual possession during wakes was well documented in Celtic tradition, though it took forms quite different from the dramatic manifestations described in later Christian accounts. Celtic possession typically involved gradual personality changes in the affected individual. They might begin speaking in the voice of the deceased, claiming to have received messages from the other world, or exhibiting knowledge of events that they could not have learned through normal means. Such possession was not necessarily viewed as malevolent, but it was considered dangerous because it indicated that the boundary between living and dead had become compromised. One particularly unsettling incident occurred near midnight when young Seamus, who had been maintaining his vigil beside his grandfather's body, suddenly began speaking in Cormac's distinctive voice. The words that emerged were not random utterances, but coherent messages directed to specific family members, providing information about hidden family treasures, unresolved debts, and instructions for the care of Cormac's livestock. The messages were so accurate and detailed that even the skeptical mourners began to believe that Cormac's spirit was genuinely communicating through his grandson. Moira recognized the danger immediately. While the communication might indeed be authentic contact with Cormac's spirit, it also represented a potentially dangerous breach in the spiritual barriers that protected the living from becoming trapped in the realm of the dead. She quickly intervened with traditional protective measures, sprinkling salt around Seamus, placing iron objects in his hands, and chanting protective invocations that were designed to strengthen his connection to the living world, while respectfully requesting that his grandfather's spirit maintain appropriate boundaries. The incident highlighted one of the fundamental tensions in Celtic wake traditions. The mourners desperately wanted contact with their deceased relative, confirmation that his spirit persisted, and that the bonds of love and family remained intact even after death. Yet such contact was inherently dangerous, as it created pathways that hostile spirits could exploit and risked drawing the living too deeply into the realm of the dead. The protective measures employed during wakes reflected this complex balance between invitation and protection. The candles that burned throughout the night served multiple purposes. They provided light that helped distinguish between natural shadows and supernatural manifestations. They created warmth that was believed to comfort both the living and the dead, and their flames were thought to serve as beacons that helped guide friendly spirits while repelling hostile ones. The specific herbs burned in the cottage during the wake also served protective functions. Juniper berries were scattered on the fire to create smoke that purified the air and drove away malevolent entities. Rowan wood was burned for its protective properties, while sprigs of vervain were hung around the room to prevent spirits from becoming confused about their proper realm of existence. These botanical protections were not mere superstition, but represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about the spiritual properties of natural substances. The role of iron in wake protection was particularly significant in Celtic tradition. Iron objects were placed not only around the room but directly on the deceased's body. Iron nails driven into the coffin, iron keys placed in the hands, iron coins laid upon the eyes. The metal was believed to serve as a spiritual anchor, preventing the deceased spirit from drifting too far from its proper resting place, while simultaneously creating barriers that hostile spirits could not cross. But perhaps the most important protective element during wakes was the presence of the watchers themselves. The requirement that someone remain awake and vigilant throughout every hour of darkness was not merely about showing respect or preventing physical disturbance of the body. The watchers served as living guardians whose consciousness and spiritual awareness created a protective field around the deceased. Their constant attention, their emotional connection to the dead person, and their knowledge of proper protective procedures combined to create conditions that encouraged beneficial spiritual contact while discouraging malevolent interference. As the second night progressed toward dawn, the atmosphere in the cottage grew increasingly intense. The combination of sleep deprivation, emotional stress, and spiritual vigilance created altered states of consciousness among the mourners that blurred the boundaries between waking and sleeping, between rational thought and mystical experience. Several participants reported seeing Cormac's spirit moving around the room, sometimes appearing as a translucent version of his living self, sometimes manifesting as inexplicable shadows or sudden temperature changes. The grave goods placed with Cormac's body told the story of a life lived according to Celtic values and prepared for continuation in the other world. His weapons, an iron sword that had belonged to his father and a hunting spear he had crafted himself, were positioned within easy reach as the journey to the other world was believed to present challenges that might require armed defense. Food and drink for the journey included a loaf of bread baked by his wife, a leather flask filled with Highland whiskey, and dried meat that would sustain him during the long travel ahead. But the most significant grave goods were those that reflected Cormac's relationships with the living world he was leaving behind. Personal items from each family member were included in the burial. A wooden carving made by his son, an embroidered cloth created by his daughter, and a small stone painted with protective symbols by his grandchildren. These objects served as tangible connections to the love and care of his family, providing comfort during the potentially lonely journey to the other world, while ensuring that the bonds of kinship would persist even after death. The actual burial ceremony reflected the complex Celtic understanding of death as both ending and beginning. As Cormac's body was lowered into the earth, the mourners did not merely express grief for their loss, but actively participated in sending him forward to his new existence. The keening women shifted their lamentations from expressions of sorrow to songs of encouragement, urging the departed spirit to embrace the adventure ahead and to remember always the love of those he left behind. The burial mound that covered Cormac's grave was constructed according to precise specifications that had been maintained in Celtic tradition for countless generations. The earth was arranged in a specific pattern that was believed to channel beneficial spiritual energy downward to the buried body while preventing negative influences from disturbing the deceased's rest. Stones were placed at cardinal points around the mound, creating a protective boundary that marked the grave as sacred space that should not be casually disturbed. But the most important aspect of the burial was not the physical interment, but the spiritual transition that it represented. According to Celtic belief, the moment of burial marked the deceased's final departure from the world of the living and their entry into a realm where different rules applied. This transition was not instantaneous. It was believed to take several days or even weeks to complete, during which time the spirit might still maintain some connection to the living world. The post-burial customs reflected this gradual transition. For 9 days after the burial, family members would visit the grave site at dawn and dusk, leaving small offerings of food and drink while speaking aloud to the deceased as if he could still hear and respond. These visits served multiple purposes. They provided comfort to the mourners, demonstrated continued love and respect for the departed, and helped ensure that the spirit's transition to the other world proceeded smoothly without complications. The dreams experienced by family members during the weeks following burial were carefully monitored and interpreted as potential communications from the deceased. Dreams in which Cormac appeared healthy and at peace were taken as confirmation that his spirit had successfully reached the other world and achieved the restful existence that Celtic death customs were designed to facilitate. Disturbing dreams, by contrast, might indicate that something had gone wrong with the transition process and that additional protective measures might be needed. One particularly significant dream was experienced by Seamus 3 weeks after his grandfather's burial. In the dream, Cormac appeared as a younger version of himself, dressed in the fine clothing he had been buried in, but showing no signs of death or decay. He spoke to his grandson about the journey he had undertaken since leaving the world of the living, describing a realm of eternal twilight where the seasons never changed and where the spirits of the ancestors lived in harmony with nature. Most importantly, Dream Cormac provided specific guidance about family matters that required attention in his absence. He warned of a harsh winter ahead and advised the family to stockpile additional food supplies. He revealed the location of a small cache of silver coins he had hidden during his lifetime, and he provided detailed instructions about the care of his favorite horse, which had been refusing to eat since his death. When Seamus awoke and shared these dream revelations with his family, they found that every detail could be verified through external evidence. The hidden silver was exactly where Dream Cormac had indicated. The horse immediately resumed eating when treated according to the deceased's instructions, and the predicted harsh winter did indeed arrive early that year. Such experiences provided powerful confirmation of Celtic beliefs about the persistence of consciousness after death and the possibility of beneficial communication between the living and the dead. But the dream also raised profound questions about the nature of death and sleep that would continue to trouble the McBride family for years to come. If Cormac's consciousness persisted in the other world with sufficient clarity to provide practical guidance about earthly matters, what did this suggest about the relationship between sleeping and dying? Were the dead simply experiencing an extended form of sleep from which they might someday awaken? And if the boundary between sleep and death was so permeable, what implications did this have for the living? when they surrendered their consciousness each night to ordinary sleep. As autumn deepened into winter and the long Highland nights grew ever longer, the McBride family found themselves changed by their experience of Cormac's 3-day wake and its aftermath. They had not merely witnessed death, they had participated in a complex spiritual process that revealed the profound interconnectedness of sleeping, dying, and the mysterious consciousness that seemed to persist beyond both. They had learned that the Celtic understanding of death as eternal sleep was not merely a comforting metaphor, but a literal description of an ongoing state of existence that maintained connections to the world of the living. Yet questions remained that would haunt their own sleep for years to come. If death was indeed a form of sleep, and if the sleeping dead could communicate with the living through dreams, what other entities might be using the vulnerable state of sleep to establish contact with human consciousness? And most unsettling of all, how could the living ever again experience ordinary sleep without wondering whether they were unconsciously practicing for their own eventual journey to the realm where Cormac now rested in eternal twilight? In the remote valleys of ancient Wales, where mist clung to the hillsides like the breath of sleeping giants, Rhiannon Furch Cadwallon stood at the threshold of her family's stone cottage, performing the evening protection ritual that had been passed down through countless generations of Celtic women. The doorway beneath her feet was not merely an architectural feature, but a spiritual boundary, a liminal space where the world of the living intersected with realms that no mortal should enter unprepared. As the last light faded from the western sky, Rhiannon carefully sprinkled a line of blessed salt across the threshold, creating an invisible barrier that malevolent spirits would find impossible to cross. The threshold of a dwelling was considered one of the most vulnerable points in Celtic household protection, a place where the spiritual defenses of the home could be breached if proper precautions were not maintained with meticulous care. The cottage behind her was typical of Celtic dwellings in the 6th century CE, but its apparent simplicity concealed an elaborate system of spiritual protections that had been woven into every aspect of its construction and daily maintenance. From the carefully selected stones of its foundation to the specific herbs planted around its perimeter, from the iron nails driven into its doorframe to the protective symbols carved into its roof beams, every element of the dwelling had been designed to create a sanctuary where the family could sleep safely through the dangerous hours of darkness. Celtic beliefs about nighttime spirits were both sophisticated and terrifying. The hours between sunset and dawn were understood to be a time when the veil between worlds grew thin, allowing entities from the other world to cross into the realm of the living. Not all of these spirits were malevolent. Some were benevolent ancestors seeking to protect their descendants. Others were nature spirits with no particular interest in human affairs, but many were actively hostile to human life and sought opportunities to cause harm to sleeping families. The most feared of these nocturnal threats were the sluagh, the restless dead who flew through the night sky in great flocks, seeking to steal the souls of the living. These entities were believed to be the spirits of those who had died without proper funeral rites or who had committed sins so grave that they were denied peaceful rest in the other world. They appeared sometimes as great ravens with smoke for wings, sometimes as shadowy human figures with gnarled talons for hands and feet, and they were said to enter homes through windows facing west, the direction of the setting sun and the entrance to the realm of the dead. Protection against the sluagh required constant vigilance and elaborate precautions. Windows on the west side of Celtic homes were kept fastened tight at all times, particularly during wakes or when someone in the house was ill, as these conditions created spiritual vulnerabilities that attracted supernatural predators. The windows were not merely latched, but were reinforced with iron bars and sealed with protective herbs that created barriers both physical and spiritual. But the sluag were not the only nighttime threats that troubled Celtic sleep. The night hag, known in Old Irish as the Morrigan, was a spirit that specialized in attacking sleeping humans by sitting upon their chests and creating the terrifying experience that we now recognize as sleep paralysis. Victims of night hag attacks would find themselves unable to move or speak while experiencing a crushing weight on their chest and a sense of malevolent presence in the room. The psychological trauma of such attacks could last for months or years, and repeated visitations were believed to eventually prove fatal. Celtic protection against night hags involved a complex combination of physical barriers and spiritual defenses. Iron objects were placed around and under beds to prevent the spirits from approaching sleeping humans. Sharp implements, knives, scissors, needles, were hidden beneath pillows or sewn into mattresses, as the night hag was believed to fear anything that could cut or pierce. Most importantly, protective charms and incantations were recited before sleep to create spiritual shields around the vulnerable sleeper. Rhiannon's own preparations for the night ahead illustrated the comprehensive nature of Celtic household protection rituals. After sealing the threshold with salt, she moved through the cottage systematically, checking and reinforcing the various barriers that stood between her sleeping family and the supernatural threats that prowled the darkness outside. The hearth fire received her first attention, for the flames served multiple protective functions beyond simple warmth and light. Celtic tradition held that spirits of the dead were drawn to fire but could not cross through it, making a well-maintained hearth fire an effective barrier against supernatural intrusion. Rhiannon added specific woods to the fire: rowan for protection against evil spirits, oak for strength and endurance, and hazel for wisdom and guidance, each chosen for its particular spiritual properties. The smoke from these sacred woods was not merely a byproduct of the fire, but an active protective agent that purified the air within the cottage and created an atmosphere hostile to malevolent entities. As the aromatic smoke drifted through the rooms, it carried with it protective intentions and blessings that had been spoken over the wood before it was added to the flames. Next, Rhiannon attended to the iron protections that were crucial to Celtic household security. Every entrance to the cottage, doors, windows, even the chimney, was protected with iron implements that served as both physical barriers and spiritual deterrents. Iron horseshoes were nailed above doorways with their open ends pointing upward to catch and hold evil spirits. Iron knives were driven blade first into window frames, creating invisible barriers that supernatural entities could not cross. Even the keyhole of the main door was protected with a special iron key that was never removed, preventing spirits from entering through this small but vulnerable opening. The arrangement of these iron protections followed precise patterns that had been developed through centuries of experimentation and experience. The metals had to be cold-forged iron rather than heated steel, as the spirits were believed to be particularly vulnerable to iron that retained the elemental properties of the earth from which it came. The implements had to be blessed by religious authorities, either Christian priests or traditional druids, depending on the family's spiritual allegiances, and they had to be positioned according to specific geometric patterns that created overlapping fields of protection. But iron alone was not sufficient to ensure household safety during the dangerous hours of night. Botanical protections were equally important in the Celtic defensive system. Rhiannon carefully checked the sprigs of rowan, vervain, and mistletoe that hung in bundles around the cottage, replacing any that had dried beyond effectiveness. These herbs were not merely decorative, they were active spiritual agents that created zones of protection around sleeping areas. Rowan wood and berries were particularly important in Celtic protective magic. The tree was sacred to the goddess Brigid and was believed to have the power to turn away evil spirits, prevent curses from taking effect, and protect against supernatural attacks of all kinds. Sprigs of rowan were woven into bed frames, hung above cradles and placed in doorways as barriers against malevolent influence. Vervain, known as the holy herb in Celtic tradition, was used to create protective circles around sleeping areas and to bless the water used for household purification. Rituals. The herb was believed to enhance the spiritual awareness of those who slept near it, allowing them to perceive supernatural threats in their dreams and take appropriate protective action upon waking. Mistletoe held special significance as a plant that grew between earth and sky, making it a natural mediator between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. Small sprigs of mistletoe were sewn into pillows and mattresses to protect sleepers from nightmares and spiritual attacks, while larger bundles were hung in corners of rooms to create zones of neutral spiritual energy where hostile entities could not maintain their coherence. The protective power of these botanical defenses was enhanced through specific preparation rituals that Rhiannon performed each month during the new moon. The herbs were harvested at precise times, rowan at dawn, vervain at noon, mistletoe at midnight, and they were prepared according to ancient formulas that involved blessing, drying, and charging with protective intentions. As Rhiannon completed her evening rounds of the cottage's defences, she paid particular attention to the sleeping areas where her family would spend the vulnerable night hours. Each bed was surrounded by its own array of protections: iron nails driven into the floor at the four corners, salt circles renewed weekly, and protective charms sewn into mattresses and pillows. The positioning of the beds themselves followed traditional patterns that aligned them with beneficial spiritual currents while avoiding orientations that might invite supernatural interference. The children's sleeping area received the most elaborate protections, as the young were believed to be particularly vulnerable to spiritual attack. Their innocence and lack of spiritual defenses made them attractive targets for entities that fed on life force or sought to possess human consciousness. Special attention was paid to creating multiple layers of protection around their sleeping space: blessed herbs in their pillows, iron charms under their mattresses, and protective symbols painted on the walls around their beds. But perhaps the most important element in Celtic household protection was not any physical barrier or spiritual charm, but the vigilance and spiritual awareness of the family members themselves. Rhiannon understood that no amount of iron or herbs could protect a household whose inhabitants had grown careless about maintaining proper spiritual hygiene. The family's daily prayers, their respect for traditional protective customs, and their constant awareness of supernatural threats were as crucial to their safety as any physical barrier. As midnight approached, and the cottage settled into the deep quiet that preceded the most dangerous hours of the night, Rhiannon made her final preparations for sleep. She recited the ancient protective prayers that her grandmother had taught her, speaking words in the old tongue that created spiritual shields around each family member. She checked once more that all physical protections were in place and properly arranged, and she prepared herself mentally for the vigilant half-sleep that experienced Celtic women maintained throughout the night. A state of rest that allowed physical restoration while keeping spiritual awareness alert to any supernatural threats that might penetrate the cottage's defenses. But as she lay down upon her own protected bed, surrounded by layers of iron, herbs, and sacred symbols, Rhiannon could not help but wonder about the true nature of the threats that made such elaborate defenses necessary. What was it about the hours of sleep that made human consciousness so vulnerable to supernatural attack? Why did entities from the other world seem so determined to interfere with the rest that mortals required for survival. And most troubling of all, what would happen to her family if even one element of their protective system failed during the long, dark hours that lay ahead? The first sign of supernatural presence came at the stroke of midnight, when the cottage's carefully tended hearth fire suddenly dimmed without any natural cause. Rhiannon, maintaining the light sleep of practiced vigilance that Celtic women learned from childhood, immediately awakened and recognized the spiritual disturbance that was attempting to penetrate her home's defenses. The dimming flames were not mere coincidence, but a deliberate attack on one of the household's primary protective barriers. Moving silently through the cottage to avoid waking her sleeping family, Rhiannon approached the hearth with the calm competence of someone who had faced such intrusions before. She spoke a quiet invocation to Brigid, the Celtic goddess of hearth and home, while adding carefully selected woods to the fire. The flames immediately brightened, their renewed light driving back shadows that had begun to gather in corners, where shadows should not exist at midnight in a properly lit room. But the attack on the hearth fire was only the beginning. As Rhiannon returned to her position of watchful rest, she became aware of other disturbances that indicated a coordinated supernatural assault on the cottage's defenses. The iron horseshoe above the main door began to vibrate with a soft humming, sound that had no earthly source. The sprigs of rowan hanging in the windows rustled as if touched by wind, though the night air was completely still. Most ominously, the protective salt line across the threshold showed signs of disturbance, not as if it had been crossed, but as if something had tested its strength and found it insufficient for its purposes. These signs pointed to the presence of what Celtic tradition classified as night visitors, supernatural entities that specifically sought to gain access to households during the vulnerable hours when families were sleeping. Unlike the random spiritual phenomena that might occur anywhere, night visitors were intelligent, purposeful beings that had learned to probe and exploit weaknesses in human protective systems. The most common type of night visitor was the bean cedar or banshee, a female spirit whose wailing presence was traditionally associated with imminent death in the family. But the banshees that appeared during household intrusions were not the mournful harbingers of Celtic legend. These were darker entities, corrupted spirits that fed on the terror and life force of sleeping humans. They would attempt to enter homes by appearing as familiar figures, mimicking the voices of family members or deceased relatives to trick householders into lowering their spiritual defenses. As if summoned by Rhiannon's thoughts, the sound of a woman's voice began to drift through the cottage from no identifiable source. The voice was hauntingly familiar. It sounded exactly like Rhiannon's sister Branwen, who had died in childbirth 3 years earlier. The voice called softly through the walls, speaking Rhiannon's name with the intimate affection that only a beloved sister could convey, pleading to be allowed inside where she could find warmth and rest. Celtic protective traditions were explicit about how to respond to such supernatural deceptions. No matter how authentic the voice might sound, no matter how desperate the plea for entry might become, household protectors were never to respond to nighttime visitations by opening doors, windows, or any other barrier that separated the living space from the outside world. The entities that could perfectly mimic human voices were among the most dangerous of all supernatural threats, as they combined intelligence, malevolence, and an intimate knowledge of human emotional vulnerabilities. Rhiannon remained motionless and silent, though every instinct urged her to respond to what sounded like her sister's voice calling for help. She understood that acknowledging the presence would only encourage further attacks, while maintaining absolute silence would eventually frustrate the entity into seeking easier prey elsewhere. The voice continued for nearly an hour, becoming increasingly desperate and accusatory, claiming that Rhiannon's cruelty in refusing entry was causing unbearable suffering to her sister's wandering spirit. But Rhiannon had been well trained in the psychological warfare that night visitors employed. The entities that could mimic human voices were skilled at exploiting guilt, grief, and love to break down the spiritual defenses of their intended victims. They would claim to be deceased relatives suffering in the other world, lost children seeking their way home, or wounded travelers requiring shelter and aid. The emotional manipulation could be extraordinarily sophisticated, incorporating intimate details about family relationships that should have been impossible for outsiders to know. As the false Branwen's voice finally faded away, replaced by the normal sounds of night wind and settling timber, Rhiannon turned her attention to protecting her sleeping children from the next phase of supernatural assault. Night visitors that failed to gain entry through deception often attempted to influence the dreams of household members, particularly the young, whose spiritual defenses were not yet fully developed. The nightmare attacks began with her youngest son, 6-year-old Gwern, who started thrashing in his sleep and calling out in terror. Rhiannon recognized the signs immediately. The child was experiencing what Celtic tradition called spirit dreams, visions imposed by external entities rather, and then arising from natural sleep processes. These dreams were designed to weaken the child's spiritual resistance and create openings that hostile spirits could exploit for more direct attacks. Rhiannon's response was swift and decisive. She sprinkled blessed salt around Gwern's bed, while reciting protective incantations that were specifically designed to sever supernatural connections to sleeping minds. She placed additional iron charms under his pillow and burned a small amount of vervain on a clay dish near his head, creating protective smoke that would purify his sleeping consciousness and drive away any intrusive spiritual influences. The protective measures were effective, but they required constant vigilance to maintain. Throughout the night, Rhiannon found herself repeatedly awakening to reinforce the household's spiritual defenses as they came under sustained attack from multiple directions. The supernatural assault displayed a level of coordination and persistence that suggested the involvement of highly intelligent entities, possibly the Sluagh themselves, the restless dead who were said to organize coordinated attacks on particularly well-defended households. The nature of these attacks revealed sophisticated knowledge of Celtic protective systems. The entities did not merely attempt to overwhelm the defenses through brute spiritual force. Instead, they probed for specific weaknesses, testing whether the iron implements had been properly blessed, checking whether the botanical protections had been renewed recently, searching for gaps in the salt barriers where they might achieve penetration. One particularly insidious attack involved the manipulation of familiar household sounds to create confusion and fear. The entities began producing noises that perfectly mimicked normal domestic activities: footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing, the sound of someone moving about the cottage as if going about normal nightly routines. These sounds were designed to trick family members into believing that someone was awake and moving around, potentially causing them to leave their protected sleeping areas to investigate. Rhiannon recognized this tactic from her grandmother's teachings about supernatural warfare. The entities that could produce convincing auditory illusions were among the most dangerous because they could exploit the natural human tendency to investigate unusual sounds, particularly when those sounds suggested that a family member might be in distress. Many households had been compromised when well-meaning family members left their protected sleeping areas to check on what they believed to be real disturbances. The key to resisting such manipulation was to remember that any genuine household emergency would be accompanied by other sensory evidence: changes in temperature, alterations in the behavior of protective animals, or disturbances in the carefully maintained spiritual atmosphere of the home. The supernatural mimicry was typically limited to sound alone, making it detectable to those who knew what signs to look for. As the night progressed toward its most dangerous hours, the period between 3 and 4 a.m. when human spiritual resistance was at its lowest ebb, these supernatural attacks on the cottage intensified dramatically. The entities seemed to abandon their attempts at deception and stealth in favor of direct assault on the household's protective barriers. The iron implements began to vibrate more violently. The protective herbs showed signs of spiritual burning, despite having no contact with physical flame, and the salt barriers started to develop small gaps that appeared spontaneously without any visible cause. Rhiannon understood that the cottage's defenses were reaching their limits. The sustained supernatural assault was depleting the spiritual energy that powered the protective systems, and without reinforcement, the barriers would eventually fail completely. This was the moment when the most experienced Celtic household defenders employed their most powerful protective techniques, rituals that had been passed down through generations of women who had faced similar spiritual sieges. Moving to the cottage's central room, Rhiannon began the process of renewing and amplifying the household's protective field through a complex ritual that combined elements of traditional Celtic magic with innovations developed through centuries of practical experience. She lit a special candle made from beeswax that had been blessed by druids and infused with protective herbs during its creation. The flame of this candle would serve as a spiritual beacon, strengthening all other protective elements within the household, while calling upon the aid of benevolent spirits who might assist in the defense. The renewal ritual required Rhiannon to visit every protected area within the cottage, reinforcing the spiritual barriers through a combination of blessed salt, protective incantations, and iron implements arranged in specific geometric patterns. At each location, she spoke ancient words of power that had been preserved in her family's oral tradition, words that were believed to have been taught to the first Celtic women by the goddess Brigid herself. But the most crucial element of the renewal ritual was the offering of personal energy that Rhiannon made to strengthen the household's defenses. This was not a symbolic gesture, but a literal transfer of her own life force to power the protective systems that stood between her family and the supernatural entities attempting to gain entry. The process left her weakened and vulnerable, but it provided the spiritual energy necessary to maintain the cottage's defenses through the remaining hours of darkness. The effects of the renewal ritual were immediately apparent. The supernatural attacks diminished in intensity as the reinforced barriers proved more difficult to penetrate. The false sounds ceased, the iron implements stopped their unnatural vibration, and the protective herbs regained their spiritual potency. Most importantly, the sense of malevolent presence that had pervaded the cottage began to recede as the entities recognized that their assault had failed to achieve its objectives. But victory came at a price that illustrated the true cost of defending against supernatural threats. Rhiannon found herself drained of energy and spiritual vitality, her natural defenses compromised by the effort required to maintain her household's protection. She would need days or weeks to fully recover from the night's ordeal, during which time she would be more vulnerable to spiritual attack than usual. This vulnerability was the hidden cost of Celtic protective systems. They required constant sacrifice from those who maintained them, gradually depleting the defender's own spiritual resources. As dawn approached and the immediate supernatural threat began to recede, Rhiannon reflected on the larger implications of the night's events. The coordinated nature of the attack suggested that the entities threatening Celtic households were becoming more sophisticated and persistent in their efforts to penetrate human defenses. The traditional protective systems that had served previous generations might no longer be adequate to deal with supernatural threats that were adapting and evolving in response to human countermeasures. The question that troubled her as the first light of dawn began to filter through the cottage's protected windows was whether the ongoing spiritual warfare between humans and otherworldly entities was sustainable in the long term. Each successful defense required greater effort and sacrifice from the human defenders, while the supernatural attackers seemed to grow stronger and more cunning with each passing generation. How long could Celtic families continue to maintain the elaborate protective systems that made safe sleep possible? And what would happen to human society if those defenses ever failed completely? The morning sun cast long shadows across the Welsh countryside as Rhiannon surveyed the spiritual aftermath of the night's supernatural siege. The cottage's protective barriers had held, her family had survived unharmed, but the cost of that victory was written in every line of her exhausted face and every tremor of her weakened hands. The iron implements that had vibrated throughout. The night now hung silent and cold, their spiritual energy depleted by hours of supernatural contact. The protective herbs showed signs of premature aging, their leaves blackened as if by exposure to extreme heat, despite never having touched flame. Most troubling of all, several of the salt barriers that had formed the cottage's primary defensive perimeter showed signs of permanent degradation. The blessed salt had not merely been scattered by supernatural interference, it had been fundamentally altered at a molecular level, its protective properties neutralized by forces that operated according to laws unknown to human understanding. These barriers would need to be completely replaced, rather than simply renewed, requiring resources and ritual preparations that the family could ill afford. As Rhiannon moved through the cottage, documenting the damage and beginning the laborious process of repair, she reflected on the broader implications of what had occurred during the night. The supernatural assault on her household had not been an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of escalating spiritual warfare that was affecting Celtic communities throughout Britain and Ireland. Traditional protective systems that had served for centuries were proving increasingly inadequate against entities that seemed to be growing stronger and more sophisticated with each passing generation. The economic burden of maintaining effective household defenses was becoming prohibitive for many Celtic families. The iron implements required for protection had to be specially forged by smiths who understood the spiritual as well as the physical properties of the metal. The herbs needed for botanical barriers had to be harvested at specific times under precise conditions, often requiring trade relationships with distant communities that possessed the necessary knowledge and resources. The blessed salt that formed the foundation of threshold protection required preparation by religious authorities whose services were increasingly expensive and difficult to obtain, but the human cost of supernatural defense was even more significant than the economic burden. Rhiannon's own condition illustrated the physical and spiritual toll that protective rituals exacted from those who performed them. The transfer of personal energy required to maintain household barriers during sustained supernatural assault left defenders weakened and vulnerable for extended periods. Many Celtic women who specialized in household protection developed chronic health problems, premature aging, and spiritual exhaustion that could persist for months or years after particularly severe supernatural encounters. The psychological impact on children growing up in households under constant spiritual siege was equally concerning. Young Gwern, who had experienced the nightmare attacks during the night, would carry the memory of those supernatural visions for the rest of his life. Celtic tradition held that children who were exposed to spiritual assault during their formative years often developed enhanced psychic abilities as adults, but they also showed higher rates of mental instability, chronic anxiety, and difficulty distinguishing between natural and supernatural phenomena. The social dynamics within Celtic communities were also being affected by the escalating spiritual warfare. Families with strong protective traditions found themselves increasingly isolated from those whose defenses had failed or been abandoned. The sharing of protective knowledge was becoming more restricted as experienced defenders grew reluctant to train newcomers who might prove unable to handle the spiritual responsibilities involved. The result was a growing division between protected and unprotected households, creating social tensions that undermined traditional Celtic values of community cooperation and mutual aid. Perhaps most troubling of all was the evidence that the supernatural entities themselves were evolving in response to human defensive measures. The night visitors that had attacked Rhiannon's cottage displayed tactics and capabilities that were unknown to previous generations of Celtic defenders. Their ability to coordinate complex assaults, to adapt their strategies in real time based on the effectiveness of human countermeasures, and to exploit previously unknown vulnerabilities in traditional protective systems suggested a level of intelligence and organization that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of otherworldly entities. The traditional Celtic understanding of supernatural threats had categorized them as relatively simple beings, driven by basic motivations: hunger, malice, territorial instincts, or confusion about their proper realm of existence. The protective systems developed over centuries had been designed to deal with entities that operated according to predictable patterns and could be deterred through established methods. But the new generation of supernatural threats displayed sophisticated strategic thinking, long-term planning capabilities, and an apparent ability to learn from their failures in ways that made traditional defensive approaches increasingly obsolete. Rhiannon began the process of replacing the degraded salt barriers around her cottage. She encountered physical evidence of this supernatural evolution. The blessed salt had not simply been scattered or contaminated, it showed signs of having been systematically analyzed and neutralized through processes that suggested scientific understanding rather than mere malevolent instinct. The entities that had attacked her household appeared to have studied the chemical and spiritual properties of Celtic protective materials and developed specific countermeasures designed to neutralize their effectiveness. This discovery forced Rhiannon to confront a terrifying possibility. The supernatural entities threatening Celtic households might not be ancient spirits operating according to traditional patterns, but rather evolved beings that were actively adapting their capabilities to overcome human defenses. If this were true, then the escalating spiritual warfare was not a temporary crisis that could be resolved through improved protective techniques, but rather an ongoing evolutionary arms race in which human defenders would need to constantly develop new methods to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated supernatural threats. The implications of this realization extended far beyond household protection. If supernatural entities were indeed evolving and adapting to human countermeasures, then every aspect of Celtic spiritual practice might need to be reconsidered. The traditional festivals that opened doorways between worlds, the sacred sites, where druids performed their most powerful rituals, the burial practices that were designed to ensure peaceful rest for the dead, all of these customs might be creating vulnerabilities that evolved supernatural entities could exploit in ways that previous generations never anticipated. The burden of this knowledge weighed heavily on Rhiannon as she continued her repairs and preparations for the coming night. As one of the most experienced household defenders in her community, she bore responsibility not only for protecting her own family, but for developing and sharing new defensive techniques that might help other Celtic families survive the escalating supernatural threat. But the very act of sharing such knowledge created additional risks, as supernatural entities appeared to be capable of monitoring human communications and adapting their strategies accordingly. The isolation that this situation created was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the evolving spiritual warfare. Rhiannon found herself unable to discuss her discoveries and concerns with anyone except a small circle of similarly experienced defenders, and even those conversations had to be conducted with extreme caution to avoid providing useful intelligence, to supernatural eavesdroppers. The sense of community support that had traditionally sustained Celtic families through difficult periods was being eroded by the need for absolute secrecy in matters of spiritual defense. As evening approached and the time came to prepare for another night of potential supernatural assault, Rhiannon faced a choice that illustrated the impossible burden that Celtic defenders now carried. She could continue to employ traditional, protective methods that provided some security but required enormous personal sacrifice and might prove increasingly ineffective against evolved supernatural threats. Alternatively, she could begin experimenting with new defensive techniques that might prove more effective but could also create unknown risks for her family and community. The decision was complicated by the fact that any significant change in protective practices would need to be implemented gradually and tested carefully over extended periods. A single mistake in spiritual defense could prove fatal, not just for her own family, but for other households that might adopt unsuccessful innovations based on her example. The responsibility for potentially determining the survival or destruction of her entire community rested on choices that had to be made with insufficient information about rapidly changing supernatural threats. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of Rhiannon's situation was the growing awareness that the escalating spiritual warfare might not be sustainable in the long term, regardless of what defensive innovations were developed. The human cost of maintaining effective protection against evolving supernatural threats was increasing exponentially, while the resources available for such defense remained constant or were actually diminishing as communities were depleted by the ongoing spiritual siege. As darkness fell and Rhiannon began her evening preparations for another night of vigilant defense, she found herself wondering whether the Celtic way of life itself might be approaching its end. The elaborate spiritual practices that had sustained her people for countless generations were becoming too dangerous and expensive to maintain in the face of supernatural threats that grew stronger and more sophisticated with each passing year. The question that haunted her as she lit the protective candles and arranged the blessed iron implements was not whether her family would survive the coming night, but whether any Celtic families would survive the supernatural warfare that seemed destined to intensify until one side or the other achieved complete victory. In the ancient hill fort of Dun Éline, deep in the heart of what would one day be called Ireland, the druid Cathbad prepared for the most sacred and dangerous sleep ritual of the Celtic year. The winter solstice approached, that pivotal moment, when the sun reached its lowest point in the sky and the forces of darkness achieved their maximum power over the world of the living. Tonight, as the longest night of the year unfolded, carefully chosen members of the community would participate in ritual sleep practices designed to navigate the treacherous passage from the dying year to the year being born. The preparations for solstice sleep rituals had begun weeks earlier, during the dark moon that preceded the winter turning. Cathbad and his fellow druids had spent countless hours gathering and preparing the sacred herbs that would guide the ritual sleepers through their otherworldly journeys. The 6 herbs essential to Celtic dream work: chamomile for purification and protection, lavender for peace and relaxation, peppermint for healing and prophetic dreams, lemon balm for spiritual development, rose petals for lasting relationships, and thyme for warding off nightmares, had been harvested at precise moments when their spiritual properties were most potent. The timing of herb collection was crucial to the effectiveness of the solstice sleep rituals. Chamomile had been gathered at dawn on the new moon, when the flower's protective properties were enhanced by the sun's first light-touching plants that had absorbed lunar energy throughout the night. Lavender was collected at noon on the day of perfect weather balance, when neither wind nor rain disturbed the Earth's surface. Peppermint required harvesting at midnight during a thunderstorm, as the plant's visionary properties were amplified by the electrical energy that filled the air during such celestial displays. But the most crucial herb in the solstice collection was thyme, whose power to ward off nightmares made it essential for protecting ritual sleepers during their journey through the other world. Thyme could only be harvested effectively during the 3 nights preceding the winter solstice, and only by individuals who had undergone extensive purification rituals to ensure that their spiritual state would not contaminate the plant's protective essence. Cathbad himself had spent 7 days in fasting and meditation before gathering the thyme that would protect this year's dream travelers. The ritual space prepared for the solstice sleep ceremony reflected the profound spiritual significance of the event. The Druids had constructed a circular chamber within the hill fort's most sacred precincts, its walls lined with carefully selected stones that had been quarried from sites where ancient gods were believed to dwell. The floor of the chamber was covered with thick woolen rugs woven in patterns that represented the cosmic forces governing the transition from darkness to light, while the ceiling remained open to the sky so that the sleepers would maintain direct contact with the celestial energies that reached their peak during the solstice night. 12 sleeping platforms had been arranged within the chamber, each positioned according to astronomical calculations that aligned the sleeper's head with specific stars whose influence was considered beneficial for otherworldly travel. The platforms themselves were constructed from oak boards that had been blessed by 3 generations of druids and carved with protective symbols that would guide the dreaming consciousness through the dangers of the solstice journey. Each platform was equipped with a pillow filled with the sacred herb mixture and a woolen blanket that had been woven from the fleece of sheep that grazed in sacred groves. The selection of participants for the solstice sleep ritual was a process that had occupied the Druid Council 4 months. Not everyone was spiritually prepared for the intense otherworldly experiences that the ceremony would produce, and choosing the wrong participants could result in permanent damage to their consciousness or, in extreme cases, complete loss of their souls to the forces that ruled the realm of dreams. The candidates had to demonstrate not only spiritual maturity and emotional stability, but also specific types of psychic sensitivity that would allow them to navigate the otherworld successfully, while remaining connected to their physical bodies. Among this year's chosen participants was Neve, a young woman whose prophetic dreams had accurately predicted the outcomes of 3 tribal conflicts during the past year. Her natural ability to receive visions during ordinary sleep made her an ideal candidate for the enhanced dream states that the solstice ritual would produce. Also selected was Fergus, an elderly warrior whose near-death experience during a recent battle had left him with the ability to perceive spirits and otherworldly entities with unusual clarity. The remaining participants included healers, bards, and craftspeople whose work required them to access sources of inspiration and knowledge that existed beyond the ordinary world. As darkness fell on the solstice evening, the ritual participants gathered in the sacred chamber while the rest of the community maintained protective vigils around the hill fort's perimeter. The Druids lit candles that had been seated in carved turnip sconces and placed them around the chamber, creating pools of flickering light that would guide the sleeper's consciousness through the other world while providing spiritual beacons. That would help them find their way back to their physical bodies upon awakening. The opening ceremony began with the recitation of ancient invocations that had been preserved in the oral tradition since the earliest days of Celtic civilization. Cathbad spoke words of power that opened doorways between the world of the living and the realm of dreams, calling upon the protection of Brigid, the goddess who ruled over the threshold between seasons, and invoking the guidance of Lu, the divine king, whose wisdom could illuminate even the darkest passages through otherworldly realms. Each participant then received a specially prepared sleeping draught that contained carefully measured amounts of herbs known for their psychoactive properties. The potion included extracts of mugwort for dream enhancement, vervain for spiritual protection, and small amounts of fly agaric mushroom for its ability to induce the altered states of consciousness necessary for otherworldly travel. The dosage was precisely calculated based on each participant's body weight, spiritual experience, and the specific type of visions they were intended to receive during the solstice journey. The consumption of the sleeping draught marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the solstice ritual. Unlike ordinary sleep, which allowed consciousness to rest while maintaining basic connections to physical reality, the ritual sleep induced by the druidic preparations would transport the participants' awareness completely into the other world, leaving their bodies in a state resembling death while their spirits traveled through realms where normal human consciousness could not survive without extensive preparation and protection. As the participants settled onto their sleeping platforms and surrendered to the effects of the sacred herbs, Cathbad and his fellow druids began the complex process of monitoring and guiding their otherworldly journey. The druids would remain awake throughout the solstice night, using their trained psychic abilities to track the progress of the sleeping participants through various levels of otherworldly reality while providing spiritual protection against the numerous threats that inhabited those dangerous realms. The first phase of the solstice sleep journey typically involved passage through what the druids called the realm of shadows, a twilight dimension that existed between the world of the living and the deeper levels of otherworldly reality. This realm was populated by the spirits of the recently dead who had not yet found their way to permanent rest, as well as various nature spirits and elemental beings whose motivations were largely incomprehensible to human consciousness. Navigation through the realm of shadows required careful attention to symbolic guidance that appeared in the form of animal spirits, luminous pathways, and geometric patterns that served as roadmaps through the otherworldly landscape. Participants who became lost or confused in this realm might wander for subjective years while only hours passed in physical reality, returning to their bodies with memories of experiences that could not be integrated into normal human consciousness. Neve was the first to successfully navigate the realm of shadows and enter the deeper levels of otherworldly reality where the true purposes of the solstice ritual could be achieved. Her consciousness found itself standing in a vast hall filled with crystalline light, where figures that she recognized as the ancient gods and goddesses of her people sat in council around a table carved from a single massive gem. The deities spoke to her not in words, but in streams of pure knowledge that filled her awareness with understanding of events that would unfold during the coming year. The visions that Neve received during her audience with the Divine Council included detailed foreknowledge of weather patterns that would affect crop yields, information about political developments that would influence her tribe's relationships with neighboring communities, and most significantly, specific guidance about spiritual practices that would be needed to maintain protective barriers against supernatural threats that were growing stronger with each passing year. Meanwhile, Fergus's consciousness had taken a different path through the other world, following trails of silver light that led him to a realm where the spirits of dead warriors gathered to share their knowledge of combat and strategy. These ghostly teachers provided him with tactical insights that could be applied to both physical warfare and the spiritual battles that Celtic communities faced against otherworldly enemies. They also revealed the locations of hidden weapons, caches that had been buried by previous generations and could be recovered to strengthen the tribe's defenses. The information received by the ritual participants was not limited to practical knowledge about future events and hidden resources. The solstice sleep journey also provided access to deeper truths about the nature of reality itself, insights into the fundamental laws governing the relationship between matter and spirit, consciousness and physical existence, life and death. This metaphysical knowledge was considered the most valuable outcome of the solstice ritual, as it provided the conceptual foundation for advanced druidic practices that could be developed and refined throughout the coming year. But the solstice sleep ritual also carried enormous risks that became apparent as the night progressed toward its darkest hour. 2 of the 12 participants failed to maintain proper spiritual orientation during their otherworldly journey and became lost in realms from which return might prove impossible. Their physical bodies remained alive but unresponsive, breathing slowly and maintaining minimal life functions while their consciousness wandered through otherworldly dimensions, where time flowed differently and the normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied. Cathbad and his fellow druids immediately began emergency procedures designed to guide the lost participants back to their physical bodies before permanent separation occurred. These rescue operations required the druids to project their own consciousness into the other world while maintaining sufficient awareness of physical reality to avoid becoming lost themselves. The process was extremely dangerous and demanded the highest levels of spiritual skill and experience. As dawn approached and the moment of solstice passage drew near, the successful participants began the gradual process of returning their consciousness to physical reality. But the transition was not simply a matter of awakening from sleep. It required careful reintegration of otherworldly experiences with normal human awareness, a process that could take days or weeks to complete successfully. The knowledge and visions received during the solstice sleep ritual would need to be carefully interpreted and applied throughout the coming year, providing guidance for everything from agricultural decisions to spiritual practices to military strategies. But the participants would also need to cope with the psychological aftermath of having experienced levels of reality that human consciousness was not naturally equipped to process, leading to questions about the ultimate value and sustainability of such profound otherworldly contact. In the weeks following the winter solstice ritual, the task of interpreting and applying the visions received during the sacred sleep fell to Ein, the chief herbalist of Dun Eilein and keeper of the ancient plant wisdom that had sustained Celtic communities for countless generations. Her stone cottage, built into the hillside beneath the fort's protective walls, served as both workshop and sacred space where the healing and protective properties of plants were refined into medicines, charms, and ritual preparations that could safeguard human consciousness during its nightly journey into the realm of dreams. But Eine's most important responsibility involved the treatment of individuals who had been damaged by supernatural contact during sleep. Celtic communities regularly dealt with cases of nightmare possession, conditions in which malevolent spirits had gained permanent access to human consciousness through dream intrusion, creating ongoing psychological disturbances that could persist for months or years. The treatment of such conditions required herbal preparations that could sever supernatural connections while healing the spiritual wounds that had allowed the intrusion to occur. The most severe cases involved individuals whose consciousness had become partially trapped in otherworldly realms during dream experiences, leaving them unable to distinguish clearly between waking reality and visionary states. These victims often reported seeing spirits and otherworldly entities during their waking hours, hearing voices that provided contradictory guidance about daily activities, and experiencing compulsions to perform ritual actions whose purposes they could not understand. Ein's treatment for such conditions involved a complex protocol that could take weeks or months to complete successfully. The first phase required the administration of grounding herbs, plants that could strengthen the patient's connection to physical reality while reducing their sensitivity to otherworldly influences. Valerian root was particularly effective for this purpose, as its powerful sedative properties could interrupt the abnormal consciousness patterns that maintained supernatural connections. The second phase of treatment involved the gradual introduction of protective herbs that could rebuild the patient's natural spiritual defenses. This process had to be carefully calibrated to avoid overwhelming already damaged consciousness with too much botanical influence. Ain would typically begin with small doses of chamomile and lavender, gradually adding stronger protective plants like vervain and rowan bark as the patient's spiritual condition improved. The final phase of treatment focused on restoring the patient's ability to sleep safely without supernatural interference. This required the creation of personalized sleep preparations that addressed the specific vulnerabilities that had allowed the original intrusion to occur. Patients who had been damaged by nightmare entities required different treatments than those who had been possessed by wandering spirits or those who had become lost during attempted otherworldly journeys. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Aine's work involved the prevention of sleep-related supernatural incidents through community education and the distribution of protective preparations. She regularly conducted workshops where community members learned to recognize the early signs of supernatural interference during sleep and to apply basic herbal protections before serious damage could occur. These educational sessions revealed the extent to which supernatural threats were increasing throughout Celtic territories. More and more community members reported disturbing dreams, unexplained nighttime phenomena, and waking experiences that suggested otherworldly interference in their daily lives. The traditional protective methods that had served previous generations were proving inadequate against supernatural threats that appeared to be growing stronger and more sophisticated with each passing year. Ain's response to this escalating crisis involved intensive research into ancient herbal formulations that had been preserved in oral tradition but rarely used in recent memory. She consulted with elderly herbalists from distant communities, trading knowledge and comparing techniques for dealing with supernatural threats that exceeded the capacity of standard protective preparations. One particularly promising development involved the rediscovery of a preparation called Brigid's Shield, a complex herbal formula that had reportedly been used by the earliest Celtic settlers to protect entire communities from supernatural assault. The preparation required 13 different herbs, each gathered according to specific lunar and seasonal timing, combined with water from 7 sacred springs and blessed by druids representing 3 different sacred groves. The creation of Brigid's Shield was so demanding that it could only be attempted once per year during the brief period between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, when the necessary spiritual conditions aligned properly. Aina had spent 2 years gathering the required ingredients and learning the preparation techniques from herbalists whose knowledge traced back to the legendary druids of ancient times. But as she prepared to attempt the creation of Brigid's Shield for the first time, Aine faced troubling questions about the wisdom of reviving such powerful herbal magic. The ancient preparations had been developed during periods when supernatural threats were presumably less sophisticated than those faced by contemporary Celtic communities. There was no guarantee that formulations designed to deal with primitive otherworldly entities would prove effective against the evolved spiritual predators that now threatened human consciousness during sleep. More troubling still was the possibility that attempts to create more powerful protective preparations might provoke escalated supernatural retaliation that could endanger the entire community. The delicate balance between human defenders and otherworldly threats that had maintained relative stability for generations might be disrupted by innovations that the supernatural entities perceived as unacceptable escalations in the ongoing spiritual warfare. As the winter nights lengthened and reports of supernatural incidents continued to increase throughout Celtic territories, Aine found herself carrying the burden of decisions that could determine the survival or destruction of her people's way of life. The herbal wisdom that had sustained Celtic communities for countless generations was reaching the limits of its effectiveness against threats that exceeded anything previous herbalists had been required to face. The question that haunted her work was whether plant magic alone could provide adequate protection against supernatural enemies that seemed to be evolving faster than human defensive capabilities could adapt. The spring equinox arrived with unseasonable warmth that set the hillsides of Dunaileen ablaze with early wildflowers, but the beauty of the awakening landscape could not dispel the growing sense of spiritual crisis that pervaded the Celtic settlement. Ina's attempt to create Brigid's shield had succeeded beyond her most optimistic expectations, producing a herbal preparation of extraordinary protective power. But the consequences of that success were proving more complex and troubling than anyone had anticipated. The preparation itself was visually stunning, a thick, silvery liquid that seemed to contain its own source of light, glowing with soft radiance that pulsed in rhythm with the breathing of whoever held the container. When consumed in carefully measured doses, Brigid's shield created a protective field around the user that was visible to those with spiritual sight as a shimmering barrier of golden light. Supernatural entities that attempted to approach individuals under the preparation's protection were repelled with violent force, often suffering what appeared to be permanent damage from contact with the herbal shield. But the enhanced protection came with unexpected side effects that were transforming the lives of those who used the preparation in ways that had not been foreseen by its ancient creators. Community members who regularly consumed Brigid's shield reported experiencing a gradual shift in their perception of reality, as if they were beginning to exist partially in the other world even while maintaining their physical presence in the world of the living. The most dramatic changes were occurring in the sleep patterns and dream experiences of those under the preparation's protection. Instead of the ordinary cycle of sleeping and waking that had governed human consciousness since the beginning of time, shield users began to experience what they described as eternal twilight, a state of awareness that combined elements of sleeping and waking consciousness in ways that transcended normal categories of human experience. During this twilight state, shield users retained full awareness of their physical surroundings while simultaneously experiencing vivid otherworldly visions that seemed more real than ordinary physical reality. They could perceive spirits and otherworldly entities with perfect clarity, understanding their motivations and intentions without the fear and confusion that typically accompanied supernatural encounters. Most remarkably, they seemed to be developing the ability to communicate directly with plant consciousness, receiving guidance and knowledge from the botanical allies that had served Celtic communities for countless generations. Neve, one of the first community members to volunteer for regular use of Brigid's shield, described her transformation in terms that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human consciousness. "I no longer sleep as others do," she explained to the assembled council of druids and elders. "When darkness comes, I do not lose awareness, but rather gain access to deeper layers of reality that remain hidden during ordinary waking hours. I see the threads of connection that link all living things, the patterns of energy that flow through the earth and sky, the constant communication between visible and invisible worlds that most humans never perceive." But perhaps the most significant change in shield users was their relationship to death itself. The preparation seemed to dissolve the fear of mortality that motivated much of human behavior, replacing it with a profound understanding of death as simply another transition between different states of consciousness. Shield users began to speak of death not as an ending, but as a graduation to more complete forms of awareness, expressing anticipation rather than dread for their eventual departure from physical existence. This transformation in attitude toward death was having profound effects on Celtic society as a whole. Warriors who had received Brigid's shield protection showed unprecedented courage in battle, fighting with a calm determination that unnerved their enemies and inspired their allies. Healers, under the shield's influence, developed enhanced abilities to diagnose and treat illnesses, as if their connection to otherworldly realms provided access to medical knowledge that exceeded human understanding. But the social implications of these changes were creating new tensions within the community. Those who had not received shield protection found themselves increasingly isolated from shield users, whose altered consciousness and enhanced abilities made normal social interaction difficult or impossible. Family relationships were being strained as shield-protected individuals developed perspectives and priorities that their unprotected relatives could not understand or share. The economic impact was equally significant. Shield users showed declining interest in material possessions and earthly achievements, focusing instead on spiritual development and otherworldly experiences that had no apparent practical value. Traditional activities like farming, crafting, and trade were being neglected as more and more community members chose to spend their time in meditation, communion with plant spirits, and exploration of otherworldly realms. Cathbad, the chief, druid who had overseen the winter solstice ritual that began this transformation, found himself grappling with questions that had no precedent in Celtic tradition. The community was becoming divided between those who had embraced the enhanced consciousness offered by Brigid's shield and those who remained committed to traditional forms of human awareness. The division was not merely philosophical, but was creating practical problems that threatened the community's survival. The most immediate crisis involved the question of leadership and decision-making. Shield users claimed that their enhanced awareness gave them superior insight into the community's needs and the proper courses of action to address various challenges, but their recommendations often conflicted with the practical wisdom of unprotected community members who remained focused on immediate survival needs rather than spiritual development. Military defense was becoming particularly problematic. Shield-protected warriors were extraordinarily effective in combat, but they showed little interest in the strategic planning and logistical preparations that were essential for long-term military success. They seemed to assume that their enhanced spiritual protection would automatically provide solutions to practical challenges without requiring traditional forms of preparation and organization. Agricultural planning was equally affected. Shield users claimed to receive guidance about planting and harvesting from plant spirits, but their recommendations often contradicted the practical knowledge accumulated through generations of farming experience. When their spiritual guidance proved incorrect, as happened during a late frost that destroyed crops planted according to otherworldly advice, the shield users insisted that the failure resulted from insufficient faith rather than flawed guidance. But perhaps the most troubling development was the increasing isolation of shield users from the natural cycles of birth, growth, and death that had governed Celtic life for countless generations. Shield-protected individuals showed declining interest in marriage, child-rearing, and the other social bonds that maintain community continuity across generations. They seemed to be evolving into a separate species whose priorities and capabilities were incompatible with ordinary human society. The question that dominated council discussions was whether the enhanced consciousness provided by Brigid's shield represented an evolutionary advancement that should be embraced by the entire community, or a dangerous deviation from human nature that threatened to destroy Celtic civilization. The preparation itself could be produced in sufficient quantities to protect everyone in the settlement, but the decision to do so would be irreversible and would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Ein, as the creator of the current formulation of Brigid's shield, carried particular responsibility for guiding the community's decision. Her own use of the preparation had given her unprecedented insight into the botanical consciousness that had guided Celtic herbalism for centuries. but it had also isolated her from the practical concerns and emotional needs of her unprotected neighbors. During her enhanced twilight consciousness, Aine had communicated directly with the spirits of the herbs that comprised Brigid's shield, learning that the preparation was designed not merely to protect human consciousness, but to facilitate its evolution toward forms of awareness that transcended the limitations of physical existence. The plant spirits explained that Celtic civilization had reached a point where further development required abandoning traditional forms of human consciousness in favor of enhanced awareness that could perceive and interact with otherworldly realms directly. But the plant spirits also warned that this transformation was irreversible and would fundamentally alter the relationship between humans and the physical world. Shield users would gradually lose their ability to function effectively in ordinary reality, becoming increasingly dependent on otherworldly guidance and supernatural resources. Eventually, they would exist more completely in spiritual realms than in the physical world, maintaining only minimal connection to material existence. The implications of this revelation forced the Celtic community to confront a choice that no previous generation had faced. They could embrace the spiritual evolution offered by Brigid's shield, accepting the loss of traditional human consciousness in exchange for enhanced otherworldly awareness and supernatural protection. Alternatively, they could reject the preparation and accept the increasing vulnerability to supernatural threats that traditional protective methods could no longer address adequately. As the spring season progressed towards summer and the time approached for making a final decision about community-wide use of Brigid's shield, both shield users and traditional community members found themselves haunted by the same fundamental question. The enhanced consciousness provided by the herbal preparation offered extraordinary spiritual insights and supernatural protection, but it also represented a form of death, the death of ordinary human awareness and its replacement with something fundamentally different. The Celtic understanding of sleep as a rehearsal for death had taken on new meaning in light of the community's experience with Brigid's shield. The preparation seemed to offer a way to experience death consciously and, voluntarily, transforming it from an feared ending into a chosen transition to enhanced forms of existence. But the price of this transformation was the loss of everything that had previously defined human life: the cycles of sleeping and waking, the bonds of family and community, the connection to physical reality that had sustained Celtic civilization for countless generations. As the summer solstice approached, the longest day of the year when the forces of light achieved their maximum power, the community prepared for a final ritual that would determine the future of their people. The decision they faced was not merely about adopting a new form of protection against supernatural threats, but about choosing between traditional human consciousness and an evolutionary transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. The question that would be answered during the solstice ceremony was whether the Celtic way of life could survive the transition to enhanced consciousness, or whether the very attempt to transcend human limitations would destroy the civilization that had nurtured such remarkable spiritual achievements. The answer would determine not only the fate of Dun Aileen, but the future of human consciousness itself as it stood on the threshold between ordinary awareness and something unprecedented in the history of mortal existence. But as the Druids prepared for the final ritual and the community gathered to witness the decision that would transform their world forever, one terrible possibility remained unspoken. What if the enhanced consciousness offered by Brigid's shield was not an evolutionary advancement, but a spiritual trap, a form of supernatural possession that promised transcendence while actually enslaving human awareness to otherworldly forces, that sought to eliminate humanity as a distinct form of consciousness? The answer to this question would only become clear after the transformation was complete and irreversible. when it would be too late to choose a different path. The summer solstice dawned bright and clear over Dun Éileann, illuminating a community that stood poised on the threshold between humanity and something beyond human understanding. As the ritual participants gathered in the sacred circle and prepared to make their final choice between traditional consciousness and otherworldly transcendence, they carried with them the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of Celtic ancestors who had explored the mysterious relationships between sleeping and waking, life and death, human awareness, and the vast consciousness that pervaded all existence. Their decision would echo through the centuries, influencing the dreams and sleep practices of cultures that had not yet been born, shaping the spiritual evolution of humanity itself as it struggled to understand the true nature of consciousness and its relationship to the mysterious forces that govern both the world of the living and the realm of eternal sleep. In choosing their path forward, the people of Dun Éileann would determine whether the future belonged to traditional human awareness or to forms of consciousness that transcended the ancient boundaries between sleeping and waking, between life and death, between the mortal world and the realm of dreams.